So a few months ago, I was given a movie recommendation for something that was a little bit odd. There's this film involving this trapper who goes out and fights men in beaver costumes. Yes, he does, and it is fantastic. It's the kind of ridiculous movie that just makes me laugh. There's a little bit of a story, but you're really just watching to see him knock the snot out of these stuffed animals Looney Tunes style, or vice versa. Not only was it entertaining, but it also had quite a few video game tropes in it. Which got me thinking, I have a job, nay, I have a duty to turn this into a playable video game. Besides just being a ridiculous concept, which is really all the reason I need to make something like this, the games that I've made so far have largely been based around movement and avoiding obstacles. I was really looking for an excuse to dive into like the AI systems and enemies and combat. Naturally, I had to start with creating the iconic enemies from the film. I modeled the beaver head in Blender and gave it some textures to give it a fabric look. I loaded up my character in Unreal to test out the basic AI and physics. I made a basic enemy using the head and the Blender base mesh. Look at those abs. Collisions were a little wonky because of the head. Okay, they were really wonky. I also created a system where you could knock the mascot head off because I just thought that was really funny. The next step, of course, was to go back into Blender, replace the chiseled human body with the beaver costume. And don't forget the tail. I got my meshes and materials in Unreal, even adding a cloth sim to the tail. It was time to turn on the AI and test my creation. I won't lie, punching beaver men is really entertaining. But as good as the models were, I couldn't help but feel that it could be better. After all, the costumes are super fluffy in the movie, so I went back into Blender and added some fur. Looking pretty nice. Pretty nice. Of course, then I had to convert it all into the groom system in Unreal and bind it to my character. But I think in the end, the result was worth it. So many beavers. Okay, now that I had enemies, I needed to do something about the playable character. And what better place to start than the hat? So went back into Blender, created the hat, this time without fur. I did make a fur version, but it's rather expensive to run in Unreal, so I decided to go without it. I also had a screen grab of the beaver death counter from the film, and I created my own. I also created a few more icons from the film that I knew I'd need for the board later. I created the counter widget to count deaths, and I had the start of a game mechanic. I also tried out a pickup system. The idea was that you could have a stack of bodies that you just bring back to the merchant, but it had its issues and I didn't want to get stuck on a single mechanic, so I ended up getting rid of it. Instead, I tried out a system that just collected the bodies, and that actually flowed pretty well and made the gameplay feel pretty good. I set up a basic deposit system, the idea being that you collect the pelts and bring them back to the store in exchange for gear, just like the movie. A bit more testing and the game was feeling pretty good. The obvious next step was to add more weapons. There are a few in the movie, but obviously I had to have the rifle. For learning purposes, of course. I grabbed this model from Fab, and I found a few basic rifle animations. I tested out a weapon pickup system, and added in line tracing so I could shoot. I also wanted to test out the firebomb, but since I didn't have a model yet, my choices were either a cube, or the head that I just made. And completely by accident, because it was so fun to run around with a beaver head and knock my enemies senseless, I decided to make it a feature. This is how games are made, people. Dumb decisions end up being awesome. I spent some time working on the aiming system and trying to figure out why my shots only triggered half the time. Turns out the trace was being blocked by another component, but it took ages to find that. But that's game dev. Half your time is spent creating, the other half is fixing problems you've created by adding more things to your game. I eventually got the rifle working. I also added a hit detection on the end of the rifle so that I could damage enemies that were in close range. I even went so far as to add bone hits to it so the enemies would ragdoll differently depending on which bone you hit. And of course, headshots. This was extremely satisfying. Once the rifle was in a good place, I finally created the mesh for the firebomb. I didn't have animations, so I just used a modified rifle animation for testing. And I almost created another feature. It was completely by accident, but the animation lined up perfectly. I briefly thought about making it a health mechanic, but it didn't make much sense because this was supposed to be one of the later weapons. So sadly, it was cut. But it was hilarious. It took a bit and a few bug fixes, but I eventually got a pretty good firebomb going. Animation, however, was another story. I had been messing around with this for about a month now, and December showed up. I really didn't want to be on this project forever, so I outlined everything that still needed to be done, including packaging, final tweaks, and this video, which gave me basically like 2 weeks to complete this game. I got my missing animations for Mixamo, for the Beaver Head Attack, Club, and Firebomb. Mixamo doesn't have root motion to it though, which means the character doesn't actually move with the animation, but I figured out a pretty easy way to do that in Blender. I'll have to make a separate video on that. With that done, I started getting my animation set up in Unreal. I went back to a level I had started earlier to be the main area for the game, which was and still is rather large for what I need, but it worked out okay. I did some more testing and bug fixing. Duplicated collisions were causing some super high launches. I also discovered a problem with trying to add fire damage to the characters. It put them in a state of falling, but they didn't actually reset because they weren't actually falling, which made them look like a bunch of psycho zombie beavers. It was actually pretty terrifying. I tried to implement a fleece system where the beavers would run away when set on fire. I was pretty happy with it, but it stopped working as soon as I implemented the rest of the AI system. I tried fixing it for a while, but with a deadline, I had to give up on it. I implemented a command to make the beavers run toward the player on spawn. Then I did some tests to see how many enemies I could actually get in the game before the game crashed. It is called Hundreds of Beavers after all. Could I really get hundreds of beavers? Not quite. I managed to get about 70 before the game became basically unplayable. However, if I disabled the fur, I got over double that amount. I didn't have time to make all the assets that I needed, so I scoured Fab for some extra resources. I found this nice cabin that looked pretty good and kind of matched what the film had. I grabbed these trees from Quixel Bridge, and I was lucky enough to get this procedural nature pack for free for the snow and trees. I couldn't find anything for the stall, so I made one in Blender instead. I made my board widget and put it all together as the home base. I had trees, some more snow clumps, and a frozen lake. It was looking pretty good, and I felt like I was on the home stretch. There were still a few things to finish, like the grenade aim, and despite the fact that I had decided not to make characters because of the time constraints, it didn't feel right to leave the character as a mannequin. So I decided to compromise and make a metahuman, resembling the film's hero. It looked pretty good, but not without the usual hiccups. I also couldn't just leave him running around the winter landscape in his undies, but since I didn't have time to make the suit, I decided to settle for some jammies instead. Using his body mesh, I sculpted a quick cloth garment for him, and that seemed to work pretty well. Definitely an upgrade to the default Manny. The one downside I discovered too late was that the metahuman character killed the hat physics for some reason. Makes me kind of sad, because I really enjoyed it. Speaking of sad, as cool as the game was looking, up until this point I basically had no sound for my game. And it was feeling rather flat. So I went and I pillaged freesound.org for sound effects, I grabbed some music from Chaucic, and with some slight editing and resolve I had sound. It was amazing to see how much of a difference sound makes. Add in a pause menu and a start screen for good measure, and I finally had a game. I will say this was a pretty fun project to work on, even if I didn't get to implement everything I wanted. There's plenty more that could be done. There are other weapons, vehicles, locations, enemies, crafting, fishing. Yeah, there's lots that could be done, and I may add some later on. I wish I could share this with everyone, but for obvious reasons I can't because I don't own the rights to any of this. But I have a few ideas on a similar game I could make if there was enough interest. But until that moment arrives, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Beavers.